You also probably know the next speaker because every week, like it must be a huge work. Like every week he's sending an email. And he's going to talk about product management for independent developers, but all those concepts would actually work for small companies. And the interesting is also that you can actually try to leverage that inside your company, even if you're a developer.
Yes.
So please welcome Dave.
So yeah, I'm going to talk this morning about product management for independent developers. But before I get started with that, I'll just give you a little bit of information about who I am and why I'm talking about this morning. So I've been working with iOS since the beginning. Before that, I did a little bit of Mac development. And for 10 years, I ran a company called Shiny Development. And that was an iOS development and training company. And during that time, I started a newsletter called iOS Dev Weekly, which you may have heard of. That became quite successful, and in an attempt to save myself some time every week, I started to develop a tool to help me put that newsletter together. That tool became a product called Curated, and 2.5 years or so ago, that product got sold, acquired by a company called Litmus, and I went to work for Litmus as part of that deal. And I worked there for 2 years until earlier this year when I left that company and started out on my own again. The reason I tell that story is that at Litmus was the first time that I had the formal job title of product manager. And that was what I was doing there, running these products for them. But actually, as I did that in a formal role for the first time, I realized that actually what I'd been doing for pretty much my entire career, certainly through every time that I was working on a product, was product management. And there's a lot of stuff that I found from that formal experience that actually applies to companies of all sizes. So let's talk about it. Quick show of hands before we get started. How many of you are actually independent developers already? That's fantastic. That's a great number. How many of you wish or are intending to become independent developers? A few more. That's good. And one more show of hands before we carry on. How many of you currently work with a product manager? A good number. So probably about half the people. So that's good. So this next slide may be obvious then, but just in case, what is a product manager? What does product management mean? So product management sits at the middle of the product development process and the product marketing process. The product manager has, well, it varies from company to company. Certainly, it depends on the size of your company. The bigger companies, product management is in itself, there are various different types of product managers. But generally, the product manager will have the vision for the product and be responsible for actually getting that product shipped and out of the door. So you're not in charge of the development, you're not going to lead the development team, but you are going to work with the development team to make your vision come true, and you're going to then work with the product marketing team to make sure it's marketed correctly. So then if we look at what does an independent developer do, now you might think of an independent developer as, well, that's the person who writes the software and then gets it out the door. But actually, being an independent developer, there's an enormous amount of tasks that you have to do as part of that role. Obviously you do the coding, you do write the software, but you've also got to take care of things like accounting. You've also got to do all the support. You've got to, or at least you've got to organize these things. You've got to do or hire somebody to help you with the design. You've got to have the idea in the first place. An independent developer, there's an enormous amount of different types of tasks, and only one of those is actually writing the software. And if we look at certainly the stereotype of what does independent developer product management mean, well, it usually starts with an idea. So this is you, you've just had your idea for your product. What's the first thing you do? Well, absolutely no time to waste whatsoever, you immediately open Xcode and start coding, right? Who's done that? A few people, yeah. Okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh. Instead, maybe you have the idea and you think, well, I should test this idea. I should see whether people think it's a good idea. So you gather a few of your friends and your family, and you tell them your idea, and they all say, yes, this is a fantastic idea. It's the best idea I've ever heard. The problem with friends and family is they tend to like you. They don't always like you, but they tend to like you. And they want you to succeed, and they want to be positive about your idea. So while they may be shouting yes at you, what they might actually be thinking is more like this. You won't get an honest answer out of your friends and family all the time. You might, but it's unusual. And in this situation, nobody wins. Just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is not kind of hobby projects or side projects or something like this. I'm talking about if you are intending, or if you are already intending to make money from being an independent developer. This is your business. This is something you want to support yourself with. And in that situation, it can waste potentially years of your time if you pursue an idea that hasn't been tested and hasn't been proven to be actually something that people want. You can waste a lot of time with this. And so what you want is you want the ability to be confident that you're building something that people actually want. I don't know whether you remember a few years ago, just before a WWDC keynote, Apple played this, well, this is a clip from it, but they played this video on stage. It was a great video. If you haven't watched it for a while, then go back and find it. I think it was the 2013 WWDC keynote. But one thing stood out to me in this, which is this saying, there are 1,000 no's for every yes. And I think that's a really important point that Apple were making there. The decisions you make about what to implement in your product are critically important, and you need to throw away a lot of those ideas in order to pick the correct ideas. Because if you are an independent developer, you're only going to have a certain amount of time to implement a certain number of ideas. So, in terms of product management for independent developers, I came up with this virtuous circle of product management. And this is something that I believe that you can take away today and do if you are already an independent developer, or if you're intending to become one, you should follow this this scheme of this virtuous circle. Or actually, if you're even in a smaller company where you don't currently do any product management, you might also find this useful. So what is it? It's 4 steps. There's research, there's the actual building of the software, there's the feedback, so talking to your customers, getting feedback on what you've produced, and then finally the marketing. And this is a circle, and every time you go around this circle, your product gets better and better and better. So let's talk about each of these phases in turn. First one is research. Like I say, you can waste an enormous amount of time implementing the wrong features, the features that haven't been proven to be wanted. And so the idea for your independent application might have come from yourself, and in fact, that's often where these ideas come from. But what you want to make sure is that you're not just solving your own problem if you're the only person with that problem. You need to make sure that other people have this problem. And one technique for customer research is, which I'm going to talk about this morning, is called jobs to be done. And this is a framework for researching what customers want. And the reason it's called jobs to be done is you're looking to find the job that your customers are actually looking to be done, rather than the product that you're that you have the idea for. So you're looking for why your potential customers made the choices that they made and why they picked the solution that they picked. There's an enormous amount of stuff written about jobs to be done on the internet. I'm going to give you a link in a few slides, and you can also do your own research. But what I've done here is I've taken what I think is the essence of this and distilled it down to something that you can do as an independent or a solo developer. So the first step is to find people who have already solved the problem that you are intending to solve. And the key part of this phrase is that you're looking for the people who've already solved it. Now, this is counterintuitive. You might think, well, what I need to find is people who have the problem that I'm trying to solve. But actually, what happens in that situation is you effectively pitch those people your idea. And you're not really listening to them. You're telling them your idea, and you're hoping that they say, yes, that solves my problem. But actually, if you look for people who have already solved the problem that you're trying to solve, then two things happen. The first one is that you immediately take away any kind of sales conversation during that, because you're not pitching these people on the idea that you've had. You're trying to figure out what their problem was, how they solved it, and you're also, the second thing is that you're dealing with facts. You're not dealing with people who say, yes, I will buy this solution. You're dealing with people who have already bought a solution. So there's a huge difference between what people actually buy and what people say they will buy. And it's really easy to be tricked into believing somebody when they say, yeah, I'll buy that, no problem. Because in that conversation, it's very easy to say, yeah, I'll buy that, because that's some purchase that's going to happen in the future. There's no commitment to actually go and buy that. By talking to people who've already solved the problem, you're talking about facts, and you're talking to people who've already made a purchasing decision. So this is what you want to do. But maybe a more practical part of this is the first two words in this sentence, which is you've got to find some people. So you want to find people who you don't know. This is where your friends and family are not going to help you. And what you want to do is you want to put together a screening survey, and this is to qualify people to say whether they are the right kind of people that you're looking for to fill in a survey about the application that you're potentially going to buy. Now, we're going to talk about the screening survey in a second, but in terms of finding those people, you can, obviously if you have some kind of following on social media or something like that, you can use that to promote a survey. But if you haven't, or if you only have a smaller audience, it's okay to kind of promote this survey. Maybe pay for some promotion on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. Get this survey outside your circle of friends and into people who have maybe solved this problem before. So let's use an example for what we're going to talk about today. Let's say that I've had an idea for a new type of to-do list app, because we all need a new to-do list app. There's definitely not enough of those in the world today. What I would do is I would put together a survey to try and find people who have already solved the problem that they are having that resulted in them buying a to-do list. So I'd start to ask questions like this. Do you actually use a to-do list? How long have you been using a to-do list for? I'd also ask questions that are open as well as closed in this survey. Now, surveys tend to attract kind of closed questions because you've got multiple choice, that kind of thing. But I'd also pepper in a few open questions like this, because what you're looking for is people who have a story to tell about this purchase process. So this is going to give you an idea of the kind of person who's filling in your survey, because you don't know these people right now. So include a couple of open questions. Maybe the idea for your to-do list that's unique is that you share it between your friends. So let's ask some questions around that, because you're looking for people who have already solved this problem. So you're kind of indicating, you're trying to find the people who have solved the right kind of problem here. You're also looking for people who, if your application is intending to be paid, which it probably is because you're intending to make a living out of this, find people who paid for an application. So you put this screening survey out there, and you ask for some time from people. So you might think, well, why are people going to give me time, especially if I don't know them? The answer to that is you offer them an Amazon gift card. People will do anything for an Amazon gift card. Amazon gift cards are actually better than money because money needs to be used for all sorts of boring things like paying bills and paying taxes and all that kind of stuff. Amazon gift cards only get to be used for stuff that you actually want. So Amazon gift cards are better than money, and people will do anything for an Amazon gift card. Again, you're going to spend some money here doing this research, but that's okay because you're going to make that money back by implementing the right ideas. The next thing you want to do is you want to get these people on the phone. You want to interview these people. You don't want to interview them by email. You want to interview them in an actual conversation. At a minimum, on the phone, ideally face-to-face, either on a video call or even face-to-face in real life, although that's unusual these days. Video call is much more common. And you want to make sure that when you're doing these interviews, you record everything that's being said. Tell them that you're recording them, but then record it. Don't try and write notes as you're actually doing the interview, because what you want to do is you want to have the process of this interview be a natural conversation, and you want to be able to follow where they're going with their answers to your questions and be able to follow up on the things that they're saying. So don't try and write notes. Don't try and plan too much. I mean, think about what you're going to say, but don't try and plan the exact questions you're going to ask people. What I go in with is something like this. 3 approximate questions that I'm going to try and get to the bottom of. And I'm going to spend probably an hour on the phone with these people, even just talking about a to-do list, because there's an enormous amount of... one of the things about jobs to be done is you're really looking to try and find the reasons people made the decisions that they made. So first of all, you're going to try and find out how did they solve the problem. Well, first of all, actually, you're going to find out what the problem was. What problem were they trying to solve when they came up with the thought that they needed a to-do list to manage their life? Then how did they solve that problem? What solution did they choose? Get them to tell you about the process. Maybe it was, quite often in this kind of situation, it's some kind of crisis moment where something bad happens and the person thinks, I don't want that to happen ever again. And so now I'm in the frame of mind to find a solution to that problem, and maybe I'm going to go start looking for something that will organize my life. That's the to-do list. Why did they make the choices that they made? Get people to tell you the story of their purchasing process. And they may not realize there is a story of their purchasing process, but there is. Get them to tell you about how they were feeling when they were trying to solve this problem. Where did they look? Did they try different things before settling on a particular solution? You really want to dig into all these reasons, and you want to find how they were feeling about that purchase process before they actually made it. And finally, one of the best things about this, and again, this comes back to the people who have already solved the problem, is you get to look into the future. You get to not only find out what people thought they would be happy with, but you get to find out whether they were actually happy with that decision that they made. So this is an incredibly powerful technique. Then what? So you have, at the end of this, maybe you've got like 10 interviews recorded. So you've got 10 hours of audio or video recordings. You go through, you make notes at that point. You listen to it all again, you make notes. And well, what we did in Litmus was we all got together in a room and we wrote all our notes down and we stuck them up on windows and that kind of stuff. And we spent days going through these notes and this kind of research. Now, you may not have a team like this, but you can still do that same process. You can still write all those notes down, and as you're writing them down, look for patterns in terms of what were the common themes that you heard from these people as they went through this purchase process. What was the problem they were trying to solve? How did they solve it? Were they happy with the results? Look for the jobs that were being done by that person and look for how they solved that process. Like I say, there's a whole load more to be read about this. If you're interested in it, I'd recommend this website. And actually, there's a couple of really interesting podcasts that were recorded on this. One especially was a sample interview. I think it was on the Critical Path podcast, where somebody gets interviewed about the purchase of a Porsche car. And it's a fantastic interview, and you'll learn a lot from listening to that. It's also very entertaining. This is not the only research that you should do. You should also do all the other kinds of research that you probably already know about, like market research, competitor research. This is not an alternative to doing those. This is in addition to doing those. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about that because, well, I've only got a short amount of time here today. But just to say that this is not the only research you should do. Step 2, you actually now have something to build. And when I say, well, actually, I'm not going to teach you how to build this. You know already how to write the code, or maybe the other people that are talking here have taught you how to write the code. But also to say that the build stage is not always about writing code. Maybe the first time you go around this virtuous circle, the build phase is actually putting together a paper prototype or a keynote prototype or something like that. The build is a process in itself, but it's not always about code. So maybe you don't quite get to open Xcode just yet. Next stage is to gather some feedback on whatever you built. So if that is a paper prototype, show people the paper prototype, get their feedback on it. And again, this is really important to actually talk to the people who are looking at your. So maybe you've put a beta version of your, at some point, put a beta version of your code out there. You want to talk to the people who are using your beta version. You want to survey them again. You want to get them back on the phone. You want to record more interviews with them. You also want to, Kate that was just talking previously was talking about analytics. And analytics are really important in this process of getting feedback. You want to look at not only what people say they're doing, so the interviews are important, the interviews are really a critical part of it, but you also want to combine those interviews with hard facts from analytics. So put analytics even in your beta versions, it's really important. There was a great example of this in one of the products I was working on at Litmus. And we'd implemented this feature. I won't tell you what the feature is specifically, just because it's fairly irrelevant to the point I'm going to make here. But the feature was designed to solve a problem that we'd heard when we were doing research. So we'd done some research, we'd designed a feature, we'd implemented a beta version of that feature, and we'd put it out to people to test. The analytics told us that nobody in our beta test group had even clicked on the feature. Assuming our analytics were working, we knew for a fact nobody had used this feature. So one of the questions that I asked in the survey was, did you use this feature? And that might sound like a useless question, but actually like 60% of people said, oh yeah, I use this feature. Now, at first I thought, well, that's strange. Why did they say they were using this feature when we know for a fact that they're not? They weren't lying. What had happened is they had this need, and they did have the need. The need was true. And then I asked them the question, did you solve your problem? And they were truthful when they said, yes, we solved our problem. But they solved the problem not by using the feature. They kind of worked around it with the rest of the software. They found a different way to achieve the goal that they were doing, or that they were trying to do. What we did was redesign the feature. We made it a little bit more obvious. We made it stand out a little bit more. And then people actually used the feature to solve the same problem they were having. But the fact that they couldn't find the feature didn't stop them solving the problem. They just worked around it because they assumed that the software didn't support it. So it's really interesting, and you definitely want to put analytics in your beta testing. Quite often, analytics is an afterthought. It's the kind of thing that you put in right before the end, before you ship a version 1 or something like that, you put some analytics in. You want to make sure that it's in even your beta. And have a plan for how you're going to get this feedback. So maybe after a week, you're going to talk to people, send them maybe just a personal email. At every stage, you're also going to check your analytics to find out what people are actually using. Then maybe after a couple of weeks, you're going to send them a survey out, see how roughly how they're finding your product. But then, again, don't forget to get them back on the phone to talk to them to see how they feel about your product. One thing to say, actually, about feedback process before I move on to marketing is you don't necessarily want to use the same people who you were doing your research with, because don't forget, those people have solved the problem already. So they're actually not your potential customers. Beta testers or people you're showing your prototypes to, they can be potential customers because you're not having that sales conversation with them. You are actually pitching them on something that may solve their problem. Talking of pitching, step 4, marketing. So, as a small company or an independent developer, the fact that you released an application isn't news. Thousands of people release applications every day, and the pure release of an application or a new version of an application is not in itself newsworthy, unfortunately. It might have been 10 years ago when the App Store first launched, but it's not anymore. So let's have a think about what actually is marketing. So marketing is all of these things and more. But if we distill marketing down to its essence, marketing is really communication. And we spend our lives communicating in many different ways, but marketing is all about getting your message in front of other people, getting the thing that you've done to be noticed by people through communication. And the most effective form of communication, the form of communication that we are absolutely designed to love and listen to, is storytelling. If you think back to your childhood, you got told stories all the time. We love listening to stories. We love telling stories. The process of storytelling does not go out of fashion. If you think about all the movies you're going to see, all the books you read, it's all about storytelling. And so what you want to do is you want to tell your story. Tell the story of what your product is going to do for the people who are listening to it. And those stories need to be authentic. The good news is that for the first step of this virtuous circle, you spent your time listening to people's stories of the problems that they had to solve. And so this is where you actually start to get this circular process in there, which is that you are listening to stories told by the people you were researching from. You're then thinking about those stories, you're refining those stories, and then effectively you're telling versions of those stories back to your potential customers. And you've got this beautiful kind of authentic story circle going around to help you market your product. And while we're talking about marketing, it's also worth talking about marketing in the context of how you spend your time. So as a product manager and as an independent developer, you're responsible for all of these things, the product development and the product marketing. And the key thing here is that you're probably not spending enough time on your marketing. People tend, especially independent developers, tend to spend more time than they should on the development and the solving of the problem rather than the telling people about why or how they solved the problem. I would go as far as to say that if you are launching a product or even launching a new version of a product, you should be spending about 50% of your time on the research and the marketing phases of this as you are with the actual development. And 50% of your time is a lot of time, and it's a lot of money that you're potentially spending on that in terms of your time. And so you might be asking, well, can I afford to do this? But I actually think the question is, can I afford not to do this? Because if you don't do this, then you might spend all that time developing your software to find out that nobody actually wants it. And so that is the virtuous circle. And the last point I want to make here is Yes, this virtuous circle can be used to launch new products, but this is just as effective when you're adding features or releasing new versions of an application or something like that. This is a process that is continuous, and you will go round and round this circle. And in fact, you might even go round and round this circle multiple times, maybe even at the same time. So maybe as you're finishing up your first release and you're in the marketing phase of that, maybe you've actually already put out surveys for the next feature. Maybe you're starting to gather people who will help you build that next feature. And actually, if you do this successfully and your product turns into something that is making money, maybe it's not just you doing these circles. Maybe you've actually managed to hire somebody, or maybe you've expanded a little bit and you have some help. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to say about product management for independent developers. So if there are questions, then we should go to talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
I really liked your talk, and I really need to apply that more to my company. And as soon as the video is available, my product owner needs to see that. And so talking about product owner and Scrum stuff, you said at the end that it's possible to apply that not just for the first version of the product, but also during at every stage of the new iterations.
Yeah.
How would you do that? How would you put that inside the Scrum methodology?
So that's absolutely, in fact, I've never used that jobs to be done framework in a new product, actually. It was only ever with new features. But you can treat each new feature as potentially a little product launch on its own. I mean, it depends on the size of the feature, of course.
Yeah.
But if it's a significant feature, then that in itself is kind of like a product launch.
And can you use that on all features? Like, do you think it could be...
I think you need to look at the size of a feature. If I was going to just add something trivial, then that would be potentially overkill. But also, you do need to think about large features as well as small features. When you've released an application, adding an occasional small feature is great, and that's good, but you also need more stories to tell people, because your marketing is an ongoing process, and you need those big stories to tell people about what they should do with your product next.
Yeah, instead of the boring README of the new version. That's interesting. And how much time and how much effort would you spend on that? Like, do you have a rule of thumb for that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I would say that an appropriate amount of time as a small company or an independent developer is probably to think about half of your time, which sounds, even when I'm saying it, it sounds too much, but it's not.
Yeah, but you're saying that for like a one-shop company, but one-person shop, but also for a small company, like, I don't know, like a 10-person company would say like...
Yeah, so potentially, this is not all you doing this. I mean, obviously, if you're a one-person company, you are responsible for doing this.
Yeah, that's why.
But still, that same percentage makes sense in terms of maybe you've got one person. Let's say you're a two-person company. Maybe one person is more responsible for that. Although I would also urge caution there, that I think it's really important that the development team or the developer of the software is involved at least a little bit in this process. And when we did these customer research interviews at Litmus, we made sure that there were engineering resources on these calls, listening to these calls, looking at the feedback, because you need your engineers to also understand why they're building what they're actually being told to build.
So you spoke before about finding a group which is outside of your people you know. You gave some examples for instance Twitter or Facebook, but don't those groups get biased in a way? Because if they follow you on Twitter, I mean, if they follow Dave, I mean, of course they will be biased. But I mean, if they follow you on Twitter, so they already have an idea on what you do, or positive or negative.
And I think that's why you want to seriously consider promoting these surveys outside of your network. So promote it outside of the people that you follow, because you do want to find people who have genuinely well, as much as possible, not the bias towards liking you.
Yeah, so like for instance, promoted ads on Facebook or...
Yeah.
Yeah, but and those people needs to have solved the problem.
They
So
do.
they are probably customers of your competitors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's also another point of.
And it's really interesting to talk to your competitors' customers. That's
probably
very
that's hard
it
to
can
find
be-
and hard to like say. Oh, okay, I'm gonna do something that is in competition with what you're using.
But that's why you asked the question about how, like, you open that survey with, "Have you solved the problem?"
Yeah,
And
that
so you can
needs to
instantly
be really
throw away,
clear.
yeah, instantly throw away the people who have not solved the
Yeah.
problem because they're not going to help you.
An issue I had in some previous experiences is that when doing interviews with groups, groups tend to be biased. So there is kind of a leader, and so you lose some small influences which actually are important.
Yeah.
Is it always one-on-one?
I very much so. I'm not a big fan of doing kind of focus groups. I think focus groups, there's all sorts of problems with focus groups. Group bias being the major one. I always like to do these interviews just one-on-one. I mean, so we had more people doing them at Litmus there because there were more of us who were involved in this project. But the conversation, we would have people silently listening into the conversation and writing notes, but then the actual conversation would be, it was actually generally two people on our side. And the reason we did two people on our side was just so that as the conversation naturally kind of ebbs and flows, somebody else can jump in with a question if it's starting to slow down, and then that just helps the interview progress smoothly.
We know
but it
that.
can be done.
That's
with
what we are
one.
doing.
Right? Yeah, exactly. You are doing it exactly right now.
So you were talking about some people that were actually not lying, but that they misunderstood the question about the feature.
Yeah.
And how do you make sure that people are actually the feedback of the people you're interviewing is reliable? Because it can be also like misunderstood or like you don't really understand what they actually want. So how do you make sure that
that comes out
passes?
in the interviews that you conduct with people one-on-one again, because when you ask them the question and when you back that up with the analytics, it's obvious what they're doing, because I mean you have to go in with the assumption that people are not deliberately like misleading you, but they're not, because they have no reason to mislead you. But to back up that conversation with the hard facts from analytics is where you really the combination of those two things is really important.
And the audio recording is also probably
Absolutely.
really interesting for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of really also interested by the fact that you're saying like saying no is really hard and is really important. And reminds me of what Max said yesterday. It was actually his problem in the open source community. So I'm really thinking that it can also be interesting in when you're actually developing open source tools or frameworks, and you need to be able to discuss with who's going to use the.
And especially when it's your own idea. I don't know about everyone else. You know, when I have an idea, it's generally I think it's a good idea because I had the
it's
idea.
It's the best idea.
So it's really hard to say no to your own ideas. But when you talk to people about your ideas, you can be a little bit more objective about whether they genuinely are something that you should spend years of your life on.
Yeah, it seems that's what Egor yesterday told us about internal tooling and how you have to actually listen to who's going to use that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.